United States federal agriculture subsidies began in 1922 with the Grain Futures Act. At this time, this act served a significant purpose: to protect roughly the quarter of the population that resided on small farms. These small farms were often largely at the mercy of weather patterns and environmental factors that could greatly inhibit or promote production. However, farming technologies and practices have drastically changed from the time this act was passed. By 1997, large farms accounted for 72% of farm sales, and only about 2% of the population actually lived on farms. Yet despite the changes in farming practices, the United States spends about $20 billion on farm income stabilization annually. It is far past the time that the federal government eliminate these agricultural subsidies. In doing so, the federal government could first, better spend the money improving the national economy, second, prevent further significant environmental damage, and third, cease the harmful effects on developing nations through international trade. Agricultural subsidies are a drain on the national economy and a misallocation of monetary resources. According to Daniel Griswold of the Coda Institute, during the past 20 years, farm programs have cost America's non-farming households a cumulative $1.7 trillion. That is how much non-farming households would have in the bank today if they had been allowed to save and invest what they had been forced to surrender to favored farmers through our never-ending farming programs. We need to ensure that Americans are not on the hook for another $1.7 trillion during the next 20 years. He went on to say, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, America's farm programs transfer about $40 billion a year from consumers, firms, and taxpayers to a small group of farmers. Tariffs and quotas on imported sugar, rice, and dairy products force American families to pay about $10 billion above what they would pay at world prices. This tax hits poor families especially hard because they spend a higher share of their budget on food. Artificially high prices also punish food processing industries, forcing confectioners and others to relocate abroad. In an article in the Washington Post, they cited that, in fact, the safety net discourages farmers from prudently putting profits from record years, such as this one, into a reserve for the inevitable downturns. Instead, they can spend the windfall on expanded production, safe in the knowledge that Uncle Sam will protect them if To his credit, President Obama put a $2.5 billion cut in direct payments over 10 years into his 2012 budget proposal. Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute stated that farm households have more stable finances today and are better able to deal with the free market agriculture than the past. Many farm households earn the bulk of their income from non-farm sources. Federal data shows that only 38% of farm households have farming as their primary occupation. The way that these federal subsidies encourage farms to produce has also had detrimental effects on the natural environment. The EPA reported that the most recent National Water Quality Inventory reports that agricultural non-point source pollution is the leading source of water quality impacts to surveyed rivers and lakes, the third largest source of impairments to surveyed estuaries, and also a major contributor to groundwater contamination and wetland degradation. Again, according to Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute, farming programs damage the environment, subsidies and trade barriers draw marginal farm land into production and encourage the overuse of fertilizer. Lands that might otherwise be used for parks, forests, or wetlands get locked into farm use. Florida's sugarcane cultivation, for example, causes substantial damage to the Everglades, yet it thrives only because of import protections. But this goes further, and according to Max Borders of the National Center for Policy Analysis, roughly half the U.S. wetlands lost from 1986 to 1997, more than 300,000 acres, were converted to agricultural use. The effects of these subsidies extend beyond the United States through international trade. Again, according to Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute, he reports that farm subsidies are a serious hurdle to progress on global trade agreements that could help protect productive U.S. exporters. Agricultural trade also damage U.S. security and global stability because they hinder the ability of poor countries to achieve stronger economic growth. Nicholas Stern, chief economist at the World Bank, is blunt about America's leadership role. Quote, "It is hypocritical to preach the advantages of free trade and free markets," Stern told the UN publication, Africa Recovery, "and then erect obstacles in precisely those markets in which developing countries have comparative advantage." In an article on freetrade.org, it is stated that the collective effect of the American farm policies is to depress the income of agricultural producers worldwide, exacerbating poverty in areas such as sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia, where people are heavily dependent on agriculture. The result of this is that in a survey of anti-American sentiment around the world, the Pew Research Center found a majority of respondents in more than a dozen countries were convinced that U.S. farm and trade policies increase the poverty gap worldwide. These sentiments transcended geographic, ethnic, or religious boundaries. In such an environment, terrorist ringleaders find fertile ground for their message of hate and violence. Therefore, due to these causes, the U.S. should eliminate federal subsidies on agriculture.